You know, I have spent the better part of my life watching human beings exhaust themselves against the very current of existence. They push and strain and fight, believing that through sheer force of will they can bend reality to their desires. And the more desperately they grasp, the more completely life slips through their fingers like water. This morning I sat by my window, watching a man in the street below struggling with an umbrella that would not open. He shook it violently, cursed it, struck it against the pavement. The harder he fought with it, the more tangled it became. Finally, in his frustration, he cast it aside and walked into the rain, soaked and defeated. I could not help but see in this small drama the entire tragedy of modern existence. We have forgotten something essential about the nature of life itself. We have convinced ourselves that we are the masters, that through effort and determination we can force outcomes, manipulate circumstances, control the uncontrollable. But what if this fundamental assumption is not merely wrong, but the very source of our deepest suffering? I have observed this pattern countless times in my consulting room. A man comes to me, rigid with anxiety because his business is failing despite his relentless efforts. A woman weeps because her marriage grows colder the more desperately she tries to revive it. A young person breaks down because their dreams seem to crumble the harder they chase them. And in each case, they ask me the same question: what am I doing wrong? How can I try harder? But this is precisely the wrong question. The question they should be asking is this: what if trying harder is the very thing that is destroying what I seek to create? You see, there is something in the human psyche that rebels against this notion. We have been taught that surrender equals defeat, that allowing equals laziness, that acceptance equals giving up. But I want to suggest to you something quite different, that there exists a way of being in the world that is far more powerful than force, far more effective than control, far more creative than manipulation. The ancient Chinese understood this. They spoke of Wu Wei, which means something like effortless action or non-doing. But this is not passivity. This is not sitting idle while life passes you by. This is something far subtler and far more profound. It is learning to work with the grain of existence rather than against it. It is discovering how to align yourself with the natural movement of life rather than exhausting yourself in opposition to it. Think of a river flowing toward the sea. Does it struggle against the rocks that block its path? Does it curse the mountains that force it to turn? No. It finds the way through, around, over, under. It yields to what cannot be changed and persistently follows what can be. And in this yielding, in this patient persistence, it carves canyons and shapes landscapes. Water, the softest element, overcomes the hardest stone, not through force, but through constancy, not through violence, but through gentle, persistent flow. But we human beings, we have somehow convinced ourselves that we must be different. We must be harder than stone, more forceful than avalanches, more determined than hurricanes. And so we exhaust ourselves in battles that need not be fought, wearing ourselves down against resistances that would dissolve if only we knew how to approach them differently. I remember a dream that came to me many years ago. I was trying to open a door, pulling and pulling with all my strength. My muscles ached, sweat poured down my face, but the door would not budge. In my frustration, I began to beat upon it with my fists until they bled. Then, as dreams sometimes reveal truth, in the most simple way, I noticed a small sign beside the door. It read simply, "Push." The moment I stopped pulling and began to push, the door swung open effortlessly, revealing a garden of extraordinary beauty on the other side. This dream has remained with me because it speaks to something fundamental about how we approach not just doors, but life itself. We often struggle for years with problems that could be resolved in moments if only we knew how to approach them from a different direction. We pull when we should push. We push when we should step aside. We fight when we should yield. We grasp when we should release. And why do we do this? Because somewhere deep in our unconscious we have absorbed the belief that struggle equals virtue, that difficulty equals worthiness, that pain equals progress. We have made suffering into a kind of religion, convincing ourselves that if something comes easily, it cannot be valuable. If we are not exhausted by the pursuit, we must not be trying hard enough. But what if this entire framework is backwards? What if ease is not the enemy of achievement, but its natural companion? What if flow is not the opposite of success, but its very essence? What if the things we most desire come to us not when we chase them desperately, but when we create the conditions in which they can naturally arise? I have seen this again and again in human relationships. The person who desperately seeks love often repels it through their very desperation. Their need creates a kind of psychic pressure that pushes others away. But the person who has learned to be complete in themselves, who can offer love without demanding it in return, who can be present without being possessive, they become naturally attractive. Love flows toward them because they have created space for it rather than trying to capture it. The same principle applies to every area of human endeavor. The artist who forces inspiration often produces work that feels strained and artificial. But the artist who learns to prepare the ground, to show up consistently, to remain open to what wants to emerge through them, they become a channel for something far greater than their individual will could create. The businessman who tries to control every variable, who pushes against every obstacle with brute force, often finds himself trapped in a web of complications of his own making. But the businessman who learns to read the natural rhythms of the market, who can adapt and flow with changing circumstances, who understands when to act and when to wait, he moves through challenges like water through a landscape. This is not about becoming passive or resigned. This is about discovering a different kind of power altogether. It is the power that comes from understanding rather than forcing, from aligning rather than opposing, from cooperating with life rather than trying to dominate it. But how does one learn such a thing? How does one discover this different way of being when everything in our culture teaches us the opposite? How do we unlearn the habit of force that has been so deeply ingrained in us? It begins, I believe, with a fundamental shift in how we understand our relationship to existence itself. Instead of seeing ourselves as separate beings trying to impose our will upon a resistant world, we must begin to see ourselves as expressions of the same creative force that moves the planets and grows the trees. We are not outside of life trying to control it. We are life itself, attempting to know and express itself through the particular form of our individual consciousness. When you truly grasp this, everything changes. You stop fighting against the current and begin to feel where it wants to take you. You stop trying to force doors that are meant to remain closed and begin to notice the ones that are already opening. You stop exhausting yourself in futile struggles and begin to direct your energy toward what actually wants to happen. This requires what I call conscious patience. Not the patience of resignation or defeat, but the patience of deep trust. Trust that life knows what it is doing, even when we cannot see the pattern. Trust that there is an intelligence operating in existence that is far greater than our small, anxious minds can comprehend. Trust that when we align ourselves with this intelligence, we become participants in a creative process far more magnificent than anything we could manufacture through force alone. Through force alone. This conscious patience is perhaps the most difficult thing for the modern mind to accept. We have been trained to believe that waiting is wasting, that stillness is stagnation, that if we are not constantly doing something, we are failing at life itself. But I have learned through decades of observing the human psyche that there are seasons to existence, just as there are seasons to the natural world. There is a time for planting and a time for harvesting, a time for growth and a time for rest, a time for action and a time for deep, fertile waiting. I think of a patient I once treated, a brilliant architect who came to me in a state of complete breakdown. He had been forcing himself to create, pushing against every creative block with increasing desperation. His designs had become rigid, lifeless things. The more he struggled, the more barren his imagination became. When I suggested he stop working altogether for a time, he looked at me as if I had asked him to cut off his own hand. But he was wise enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to listen. For 3 months, he did nothing related to his profession. He walked in forests, he sat by lakes, he allowed himself to be empty, to be fallow, like a field resting between plantings. And do you know what happened? Ideas began to come to him, not forced or manufactured, but arising naturally from the depths of his being. When he returned to his work, his designs had a vitality and beauty that surpassed anything he had created through effort alone. This man had discovered what the mystics have always known, that creation is not something we do, but something we allow. We do not manufacture inspiration. We make ourselves available to it. We do not force solutions. We create the conditions in which solutions can emerge. But here is where most people stumble. They mistake this allowance for passivity. They think that not forcing means not caring, that not controlling means not participating. This is a profound misunderstanding. The kind of allowing I speak of requires tremendous inner strength, enormous discipline, and the quality of attention that most people have never developed. Consider the master craftsman at his bench. Watch his hands as he works with wood or stone or metal. There is no violence in his touch, no struggle, no fighting against the material. Instead, there is a kind of conversation happening. He feels the grain of the wood, the natural stress points in the stone, the way the metal wants to bend. He works with these natural tendencies, not against them. His skill lies not in overpowering his materials, but in understanding them so deeply that he can guide them toward their highest expression. This is the art we must learn in living. We must become craftsmen of our own existence, learning to work with the grain of our nature, our circumstances, our relationships, our creative impulses. We must develop the sensitivity to feel what wants to happen and the skill to midwife it into being. But such sensitivity cannot develop while we are in a constant state of forcing and pushing and trying to make things happen. It requires a certain quality of inner stillness, a listening that goes deeper than the chattering of our anxious minds. It requires what I have come to call the courage of receptivity. Yes, courage. Because in our world, receptivity is often seen as weakness. We admire the person who fights against all odds, who never gives up, who pushes through every obstacle. And there is certainly a place for such determination. But there is also tremendous courage required to remain open when everything in us wants to contract, to stay soft when life seems to demand hardness, to trust when all evidence suggests we should control. I remember walking once through the countryside after a violent storm. Trees that had stood rigid against the wind lay broken and uprooted. But the grasses and reeds that had bent and swayed with the tempest stood unharmed, dancing still in the gentle breeze that followed. There was a teaching in this that penetrated deeper than any philosophical argument could reach. The rigid breaks, the flexible endures. The tree that will not bend will be snapped by the very forces it refuses to acknowledge. But the reed that bends with the wind, that allows itself to be moved without losing its essential nature, survives storms that destroy seemingly stronger opponents. And so it is with human beings. The personality that insists on having its way, that refuses to adapt or flow or yield, eventually breaks under the pressures of existence. But the person who has learned the art of conscious flexibility, who can maintain their center while allowing themselves to be moved by the larger forces of life, they develop a different kind of strength altogether. This strength comes not from resistance, but from resilience, not from hardness, but from elasticity, not from controlling outcomes, but from maintaining equilibrium regardless of what outcomes arise. It is the strength of the mountain spring that finds its way to the sea, no matter what obstacles it encounters, always moving toward its destination, but never fighting uselessly against what cannot be changed. But developing this quality requires us to confront something very uncomfortable about our modern approach to living. We have become addicted to the illusion of control. We schedule our days down to the minute. We plan our lives years in advance. We try to eliminate uncertainty, to predict outcomes, to guarantee results. And while some degree of planning is certainly necessary, we have taken this natural human capacity and turned it into a kind of madness. We suffer tremendously when reality does not conform to our expectations. We rage against circumstances that refuse to obey our will. We exhaust ourselves trying to force outcomes that may not be meant to happen, at least not in the way we imagine. And in this exhaustion, in this constant struggle against what is, we miss the subtle invitations life is always extending to us. Life is constantly offering us opportunities, but they rarely come in the form we expect. They come disguised as detours, as delays, as apparent failures, as people we did not plan to meet, as circumstances we did not choose. And because these opportunities do not match our rigid expectations, we often reject them entirely, continuing to pound on doors that will never open while ignoring the windows that stand ajar. I have seen this pattern repeat itself countless times. A man loses a job he thought was perfect for him and spends months in bitterness and resentment trying to force his way back into a situation that has clearly ended. Meanwhile, 3 other opportunities present themselves, but he cannot see them because they do not match his fixed idea of what his life should look like. A woman clings desperately to a relationship that has run its natural course, trying through sheer force of will to revive something that wants to transform or end. She misses entirely the new connections that could bring her joy because she is so focused on preserving what no longer serves her highest good. This is the tragedy of the forcing mind. It becomes so fixated on one particular outcome that it blinds itself to the countless other possibilities that surround it. It creates tunnel vision where there could be panoramic awareness. It chooses struggle where there could be flow. And the great irony is that the very things we try hardest to control are often the things that most need to be allowed their natural movement. Love cannot be forced. Creativity cannot be commanded. Trust cannot be manufactured. Joy cannot be produced on demand. These most precious aspects of human experience arise only in conditions of freedom, spontaneity, and organic unfolding. When we try to force them, we destroy the very conditions that allow them to flourish. It is like trying to capture sunlight in our fists. The tighter we grasp, the more completely it escapes us. But when we open our hands, when we allow ourselves to be illuminated, rather than trying to possess illumination, we discover that light is everywhere, always available, always generous with itself. This is what I have come to understand about the deepest movements of the soul. There exists within each of us a wisdom that operates entirely outside the realm of conscious intention. It knows things our thinking mind cannot grasp, it sees patterns our rational faculties cannot detect, and most remarkably, it works most effectively when we step aside and allow it to function. I have watched this phenomenon countless times in my own life. The solutions that have mattered most, the insights that have changed everything, the relationships that have brought the greatest meaning, they have never come through deliberate pursuit. They have emerged from periods of emptiness, of not knowing, of surrendering the need to have answers. There was a time early in my career when I found myself completely lost. The theories I had been taught seemed inadequate to the complexity of human suffering I witnessed daily. My patients presented me with mysteries that no textbook could illuminate. I tried harder, studied more, forced myself to find explanations that would make sense of the chaos I encountered. And the harder I tried, the more confused I became. One evening, exhausted by my own efforts, I simply stopped. I sat in my study as darkness fell, not reading, not thinking, not trying to solve anything. I allowed myself to be empty, to be ignorant, to be without answers. And in that emptiness, something began to move. Not thoughts exactly, but something deeper. Images arose, connections formed. Understanding dawned not as a product of my effort, but as a gift received in the space created by my surrender. This taught me something profound about the nature of knowledge itself. True understanding cannot be manufactured through intellectual force. It must be allowed to emerge from depths we cannot access through will alone. The conscious mind, for all its remarkable capacities, is like the tip of an iceberg. Beneath it lies a vast intelligence that operates according to laws we are only beginning to glimpse. When we try to force understanding, we engage only this small conscious portion of ourselves. We cut ourselves off from the deeper currents of wisdom that could carry us to insights we could never reach through effort alone. It is like trying to drink from a well by grasping at the water with our hands instead of simply lowering a bucket and allowing it to fill. I have observed this same pattern in every domain of human experience. The businessmen who succeed most dramatically are often those who have learned to feel the subtle rhythms of opportunity, who can sense when to act and when to wait, who trust their deeper intuitions even when logic suggests otherwise. They do not force markets to bend to their will. They learn to read the natural movements of commerce and align themselves accordingly. The artists whose work touches something eternal in the human spirit are rarely those who set out deliberately to create masterpieces. They are the ones who have learned to become transparent to something larger than their personal ambitions. They prepare themselves through discipline and practice, yes, but the moment of creation itself comes as a kind of visitation. They become instruments through which beauty expresses itself, rather than manufacturers of beauty through technique alone. Even in the most intimate realm of human relationship, this principle holds true. The marriages that endure and deepen over decades are not those built on the determination to make things work regardless of what arises. They are unions where both partners have learned the delicate art of holding their individual truth while remaining open to constant transformation. They do not try to control each other or force their relationship into predetermined forms. They allow love to teach them what love is. But here we encounter something that troubles the modern sensibility deeply. This approach requires us to live with uncertainty, to act without guarantees, to invest ourselves fully in outcomes we cannot control. Everything in our scientific, technological age tells us this is foolishness. We want measurable results, predictable processes, reliable methods for achieving desired ends. Yet I have found that the most meaningful aspects of human existence operate according to entirely different principles. They unfold organically, mysteriously, according to their own timing and logic. And our attempts to rush them, to systematize them, to bring them under conscious control, often destroy the very conditions that allow them to flourish. Think of how trust develops between human beings. It cannot be manufactured through any technique or strategy. It grows slowly, invisibly, through countless small interactions. A gesture of vulnerability here, a moment of reliability there, a willingness to be seen in one's imperfection. These seeds of trust are planted and tended not through conscious effort, but through the simple practice of showing up authentically, consistently, without agenda. The person who tries to create trust through manipulation, who calculates every word and gesture to produce a desired effect, destroys trust even as they pursue it. Their very effort to control the outcome prevents the organic process that could actually produce what they seek. They become like a gardener who digs up seeds every day to see if they are growing. This is the fundamental paradox we must learn to navigate. The things we most desire cannot be directly pursued, yet this does not mean we should become passive or indifferent to them. Instead, we must learn a completely different way of engaging with life. We must learn to create conditions rather than forcing outcomes. What does this mean practically? It means developing the patience to plant seeds without demanding to know exactly when they will sprout. It means having the courage to be vulnerable without trying to control how others respond to our vulnerability. It means working diligently toward our goals while holding our plans lightly, ready to adapt when life presents us with better possibilities than we could have imagined. I remember a patient who came to me desperate to find his life's purpose. He had tried meditation, therapy, career counseling, spiritual practices of every description. He read voraciously, attended seminars, consulted with experts. The more intensely he searched, the more elusive his sense of purpose became. His very desperation was creating the tension that prevented him from sensing what truly called to him. When I suggested he stop searching altogether, he was horrified. How could he find his purpose if he stopped looking for it? But I asked him to consider a different possibility. What if his purpose was not something he needed to find, but something that would find him when he created the right conditions? What if his frantic seeking was actually preventing him from hearing the subtle voice of his authentic calling? Reluctantly, he agreed to an experiment. For 6 months he would engage fully in whatever was directly in front of him without worrying about whether it was his ultimate purpose. He would tend to his current responsibilities with complete attention. He would remain open to whatever opportunities arose without judging them against some ideal vision of what his life should become. Gradually, something shifted. As his desperation subsided, his natural interests began to emerge more clearly. Small opportunities appeared that he had been too distracted to notice before. Conversations deepened, connections formed. Without forcing anything, without pursuing any grand strategy, he found himself moving toward work that genuinely excited him, relationships that nourished him, activities that engaged his deepest talents. His purpose had not been hiding from him. It had been trying to emerge through the natural unfolding of his life, but his anxious searching had created too much noise for him to hear its quiet voice. When he learned to be present to what was actually happening, rather than obsessing about what should be happening, life began to reveal its gifts to him. This is what I mean by working with the grain of existence, rather than against it. It requires developing an entirely different kind of attention than our goal-oriented culture typically cultivates. Instead of the narrow focus of pursuit, we must learn the broader awareness of receptivity. Instead of the grasping energy of acquisition, we must develop the open-handed generosity of allowing, but do not mistake this for passivity or resignation. The kind of allowing I speak of is tremendously active. It requires constant vigilance to notice when we are falling back into the old patterns of forcing and controlling. It demands the courage to remain open when everything in us wants to contract in fear. It asks us to maintain faith in processes we cannot see or understand. Moreover, this approach does not eliminate the need for effort or discipline or skillful action. Rather, it transforms the quality of our effort. Instead of the strained, desperate energy of someone trying to make something happen through sheer will, our actions become more like those of a skilled dancer responding to music. There is precision, there is intention, there is tremendous energy, but it all flows from a place of attunement rather than domination. The dancer does not fight the music or try to impose her own rhythm upon it. She listens deeply and allows her body to become an expression of what she hears. Her movements are both disciplined and spontaneous, both practiced and fresh. She has prepared herself thoroughly, but in the moment of performance, she trusts something beyond her conscious control to move through her. This is the art we must master in living. We must prepare ourselves through study and practice and the cultivation of our capacities. But we must also learn to trust the deeper intelligence that operates through us when we create space for it to emerge. We must become skilled at reading the subtle signs that indicate when to act and when to wait, when to persist and when to change direction, when to hold on and when to let go. Such sensitivity cannot be developed through intellectual analysis alone. It requires what I have come to think of as embodied wisdom. We must learn to feel our way forward, to sense the rightness or wrongness of a situation, not just with our minds, but with our entire being. Our bodies often know things before our thoughts can articulate them. Our emotions detect nuances that our rational faculties miss entirely. When we are forcing life, our bodies reflect this. There is tension, strain, a quality of effortfulness that exhausts us even when we accomplish our goals. But when we are flowing with life's natural movements, there is a different quality to our actions. Even when we are working very hard, there is an underlying ease, a sense of being carried by currents larger than ourselves. I have felt this difference countless times in my own work. When I am writing from a place of forcing, trying to manufacture insights or construct arguments through intellectual effort alone, the words feel heavy and lifeless. My body is tense, my mind is strained, and what I produce lacks vitality, even if it is technically correct. But when I am writing from a place of deep listening, when I allow what wants to be expressed to move through me, the quality changes entirely. The words seem to arise of their own accord. Ideas connect in ways I had not planned. Understanding deepens not because I am trying to understand, but because understanding is the natural result of genuine attention. My body is relaxed, my mind is clear, and what emerges has a life and energy that surprises even me. This is not mysticism or wishful thinking. This is a practical recognition of how consciousness actually operates when we are not interfering with its natural functioning. We are not separate from life, trying to manipulate it from the outside. We are expressions of life, attempting to know itself through the particular lens of our individual awareness. When we align ourselves with this deeper current, when we stop fighting against our own nature, remarkable things become possible. Yet when we speak of remarkable possibilities, we must not fall into another trap that awaits the modern mind. The trap of expecting magic, of believing that this alignment with life's deeper currents will somehow exempt us from difficulty or struggle or pain. This is perhaps the most dangerous misconception of all, because it leads us to abandon this approach the moment we encounter resistance or challenge. You see, flowing with life does not mean that life becomes easy. The river I spoke of earlier, the one that shapes canyons through patient persistence, it does not have an easy journey to the sea. It meets obstacles at every turn. It must navigate around boulders, carve through resistant stone, find its way through narrow passages that seem impossible to breach. But it does not waste its energy raging against these obstacles. It finds the way through them. And so it must be with us. When we learn to work with the grain of existence rather than against it, we do not eliminate difficulty from our lives. We change our relationship to difficulty entirely. Instead of seeing obstacles as enemies to be conquered, we begin to see them as teachers offering us lessons we could learn in no other way. Instead of experiencing setbacks as failures of our will, we recognize them as invitations to discover resources within ourselves we did not know we possessed. I think of a woman I once knew who spent years trying to force her way into a career that seemed perpetually closed to her. She applied for positions she was supremely qualified for, only to be passed over again and again. She networked relentlessly, presented herself perfectly, strategized every move with meticulous care, yet door after door remained shut to her. In her desperation, she began to blame herself, to question her worth, to wonder if she was fundamentally flawed in some way. The more she forced, the more bitter she became. The more bitter she became, the more her forcing took on a quality of desperation that people could sense from across a room. Then something shifted, not through any dramatic revelation, but through a kind of exhaustion that finally allowed her to stop. She took a position that was far beneath her qualifications, something she had previously considered unworthy of her talents. But instead of approaching it with resentment, instead of treating it as a temporary embarrassment, she brought her full attention to it. And in that attention, something unexpected began to unfold. She discovered aspects of the work she had never considered. She found herself developing skills she did not know she needed. Most importantly, she encountered people who saw qualities in her that she had been too focused on her frustrated ambitions to recognize in herself. Within 2 years, these connections and insights had led her to opportunities she could never have imagined when she was desperately trying to force her way into what she thought she wanted. The career that finally emerged was far more fulfilling than anything she had originally pursued, precisely because it had grown organically from her authentic engagement with what was actually in front of her. This woman had learned something that cannot be taught through instruction alone. She had discovered that life often prepares us for our true calling through paths that seem to lead away from it. The detours are not punishments or mistakes. They are essential parts of a larger pattern that reveals itself only in retrospect. But here is what makes this so difficult for the modern temperament to accept. We live in a time that worships efficiency, that demands immediate results, that treats any delay or indirect route as a waste of precious time. We want to know exactly where we are going and exactly how we will get there. We want guarantees, timelines, measurable progress toward predetermined goals. Yet the deepest movements of the soul operate according to entirely different principles. They unfold spirally rather than linearly. They circle back upon themselves, revisiting the same themes at ever deeper levels. They proceed through apparent contradictions, finding synthesis in ways that confound our logical expectations. I have seen this pattern in my own journey countless times. The insights that have mattered most to me, the understandings that have shaped my entire approach to the human psyche, they did not come through direct pursuit. They emerged from periods of confusion, from encounters with patients whose suffering I could not immediately comprehend, from dreams that made no sense when I first experienced them. There was a time when I found myself completely at odds with the psychiatric establishment of my day. The theories I had been trained in seemed woefully inadequate to the complexity of what I encountered in my consulting room. Patients brought me dreams that defied every system of interpretation I had learned. They presented symptoms that had no clear causes, spoke of experiences that had no place in our medical understanding. I could have forced these mysteries into the existing frameworks. I could have dismissed what did not fit, explained away what could not be categorized. Many of my colleagues did exactly this, and they maintained their professional standing, while I found myself increasingly isolated, increasingly questioned by those whose approval I had once sought. But something in me refused to betray what I was seeing. Something insisted that these anomalies were not problems to be solved, but doorways to be explored. And so I allowed myself to be led into territories that had no maps, to follow threads of understanding that seemed to lead nowhere. For years, this journey felt like wandering in a wilderness. I questioned my own sanity, doubted my professional judgment, wondered if I had made a terrible mistake in departing from accepted wisdom. But gradually, very gradually, a new understanding began to emerge. Not through forcing or striving, but through patient attention to what was actually happening in the depths of the human soul. The unconscious began to reveal itself as something far more vast and intelligent than I had ever imagined. Dreams showed themselves to be not random neurological events, but meaningful communications from layers of the psyche we had barely begun to explore. Symptoms revealed themselves as the soul's attempt to restore balance, to draw attention to what had been neglected or denied. What had seemed like professional suicide became the foundation for insights that would occupy the rest of my life. But this transformation could never have occurred if I had remained trapped in the need to know where I was going, to have certainty about the outcome of my explorations. This is what I mean when I speak of trusting life's deeper intelligence. Not blind faith in some benevolent force that will arrange everything according to our preferences, but a willingness to remain open to possibilities we could never have conceived from our limited perspective. A readiness to be surprised by life, to be taught by circumstances we would never have chosen, to discover gifts hidden within apparent disasters. Such trust requires tremendous courage, particularly in a world that offers so few supports for uncertainty. We are surrounded by voices telling us to take control, to make plans, to leave nothing to chance. We are taught to see uncertainty as a problem to be eliminated rather than as the very condition in which genuine discovery becomes possible. Yet, I have observed that the people who live most fully, who contribute most meaningfully to the world around them, who seem to have found their authentic place in the great web of existence. They are invariably people who have learned to dance with uncertainty. They have developed what I might call a comfortable relationship with not knowing. This does not mean they are passive or directionless. Quite the opposite. They tend to be remarkably focused and purposeful. But their focus comes not from rigid adherence to predetermined plans, but from deep attunement to what wants to emerge through them in each moment. Their purpose is not something they possess, but something that possesses them. I have watched this quality in the great artists I have known. They do not sit down with the intention of creating a masterpiece. They cannot, because true art cannot be manufactured through intention alone. Instead, they prepare themselves through discipline and practice. They make themselves available through attention and openness, and then they allow something to work through them that is larger than their individual will. The painter stands before a blank canvas, not with a complete vision of what the finished work will look like, but with a quality of receptive alertness. He makes the first mark, then responds to what that mark suggests. Each stroke leads to the next, not through predetermined design, but through ongoing conversation between the artist and the emerging work. The painting teaches the painter how to paint it. This requires enormous skill and preparation, but it also requires the willingness to be surprised, to be taken in directions the conscious mind had not planned. The greatest paintings I've seen carry this quality of spontaneous discovery. You can feel in them the moment when the artist stopped trying to control the outcome and began to serve something larger than his personal agenda. The same principle operates in every domain where true creativity manifests. The scientist who makes revolutionary discoveries is rarely the one who sets out methodically to prove a particular theory. More often, it is the researcher who remains open to unexpected results, who can recognize significance in observations that contradict his expectations, who allows his inquiry to be guided by what the phenomena themselves reveal. Even in the most practical matters of daily life, this quality of creative responsiveness proves invaluable. The parent who tries to force a child into a predetermined mold often creates rebellion or conformity that kills the child's authentic spirit. But the parent who can remain present to who this unique being actually is, who can guide without dominating, who can provide structure while allowing for natural unfolding, they help bring forth individuals who are both grounded and free. The teacher who insists on delivering predetermined lessons regardless of what is actually happening in the classroom may cover the required material, but often misses entirely the real learning that wants to occur. But the teacher who can sense what is alive in the moment, who can recognize the questions that are actually stirring in students' minds, who can adapt the lesson to serve what is trying to emerge, they create conditions in which genuine understanding can dawn. This is the art of conscious collaboration with life. It requires us to bring our full attention, our deepest preparation, our most refined skills to whatever we are engaged in. But it also asks us to hold our plans lightly, to remain alert to possibilities we had not considered, to trust that there is an intelligence operating in situations that exceeds our individual comprehension. I remember a conversation I once had with a master carpenter, a man who had worked with wood for more than 50 years. I asked him how he approached a new piece, how he decided what to create. He was quiet for a long moment, then said something I have never forgotten. "I don't decide," he told me. "I listen. Every piece of wood has something it wants to become. My job is to hear what that is and help it happen." This struck me as a profound description of how we might approach not just craftsmanship, but existence itself. Instead of imposing our will upon the raw material of our circumstances, we might learn to listen for what wants to emerge through the particular conditions of our lives. Instead of forcing outcomes, we might develop the sensitivity to recognize what is trying to happen and the skill to midwife it into being. But such listening requires a quality of inner stillness that is increasingly rare in our age of constant stimulation and perpetual urgency. We have become accustomed to filling every moment with activity, every silence with noise, every pause with planning. We have forgotten how to be empty, how to wait, how to allow space for something unexpected to arise. Yet it is precisely in these spaces of not doing that life often reveals its deepest intentions. I have noticed that my most significant insights come not when I am striving to understand, but when I am simply present with what I do not yet comprehend. The solutions that matter most emerge not from forced thinking, but from a quality of open attention that allows connections to form naturally. There is a difference, you see, between the emptiness of depression or apathy and the fertile emptiness of conscious receptivity. The first is a closing down, a withdrawal from life's possibilities. The second is an opening up, making oneself available to whatever wants to enter. The first leads to stagnation. The second creates conditions for genuine renewal. I have learned to recognize this fertile emptiness in myself and to trust it even when it feels uncomfortable. There are times when I know that something is trying to emerge in my understanding, but I cannot yet grasp what it is. The temptation is always to force clarity, to push for resolution, to make something happen through sheer mental effort. But I have found that such forcing invariably produces insights that are premature, incomplete, somehow lacking in the vitality that comes with right timing. It is like picking fruit before it is ripe. The form may be there, but the essence is missing. When I can resist this temptation to force, when I can remain present with not knowing while continuing to tend the question with gentle attention, something different occurs. Understanding ripens naturally, like fruit developing its sweetness through patient exposure to sun and rain. What emerges has a completeness, a rightness that could never be manufactured through effort alone. This capacity for conscious waiting, for fertile receptivity, for what we might call active patience, it is perhaps the most essential skill for anyone who wishes to work with life rather than against it. But it must be distinguished clearly from passive resignation or indifferent withdrawal. The patience I speak of is tremendously alert, tremendously present. It is like a cat watching a mouse hole, completely relaxed, yet instantly ready to respond when the moment for action arrives. There is no forcing, but there is also no absence of engagement. There is a quality of poised availability, of readiness without grasping. Such readiness allows us to recognize opportunities that our forcing mind would miss entirely. When we are fixated on making one particular thing happen, we become blind to the countless other possibilities that surround us. But when we can hold our intentions lightly while remaining alert to what is actually available, we often discover options that are far better than anything we could have planned. D. I think of a garden I once tended behind my home in Küsnacht. For years I approached it like a general commanding an army. I would march out each morning with my plans and tools, determined to bend every plant to my vision of what the garden should become. I pruned ruthlessly, transplanted constantly, fought weeds as if they were personal enemies, and yet, season after season, something felt wrong. The garden grew, yes, but it lacked soul. It was orderly but not alive, controlled but not beautiful. One spring, illness kept me bedridden for several weeks. I could only lie by my window and watch as the garden began to do what it wished without my interference. Weeds appeared where I had not planned them. Plants grew in directions I had never intended. Flowers bloomed in combinations I would never have chosen. And slowly, to my great surprise, something magical began to emerge. The garden was teaching me about its own nature, revealing possibilities I had been too busy controlling to notice. The wild roses wanted to climb the old oak tree. The herbs preferred the shadier corner where I had been trying to grow vegetables. The morning glories had their own ideas about where beauty belonged. When I finally returned to my feet and walked among these unplanned developments, I felt as though I was discovering the garden for the first time. This taught me something profound about the relationship between human intention and natural unfolding. I had been so concerned with imposing my idea of order that I had ignored the deeper intelligence already present in the soil, the seeds, the changing seasons. My garden flourished not despite my absence, but because of it. Because in my absence life was free to express its own inherent wisdom. How many areas of human existence follow this same pattern? How often do our most determined efforts produce exactly the opposite of what we seek? I have watched patients exhaust themselves trying to force happiness, only to discover that happiness is something that visits us when we are engaged in activities that have nothing to do with the pursuit of happiness itself. I have seen lovers grow more distant the harder they try to create intimacy, because intimacy cannot be manufactured through techniques or strategies. It arises naturally between people who have learned to be genuine in each other's presence. The businessman who grasps desperately for success often repels the very opportunities he seeks. His desperation creates a quality of energy that others find uncomfortable, even repulsive. But the businessman who can remain present to the work itself, who can contribute value without being attached to particular outcomes, often finds that success seeks him out. Not because he cares less, but because he has learned to care in a different way. This different way of caring is perhaps the most difficult thing for the modern mind to understand. We have been trained to believe that caring means controlling, that love means possession, that commitment means forcing outcomes. But I have learned that there is a deeper kind of caring that operates through release rather than grasp, through trust rather than control, through presence rather than manipulation. I think of the way a skilled physician approaches a patient. He brings all his knowledge, all his training, all his attention to the encounter, but he does not try to force healing. He creates conditions in which the body's own healing intelligence can operate. He removes obstacles, provides support, offers what is needed, but he understands that the actual healing comes from sources beyond his conscious control. The greatest doctors I have known carry this quality of informed surrender. They are simultaneously completely engaged and completely unattached to results. They do everything in their power to help, but they do not burden themselves or their patients with the impossible responsibility of guaranteeing outcomes. They serve the healing process rather than trying to dominate it. And so it must be with all our deepest endeavors. We must learn to bring our full capacity to whatever we undertake, while simultaneously releasing our need to control how that capacity expresses itself. We must develop what I have come to think of as passionate detachment, not the cold distance of indifference, but the warm spaciousness of love that gives without demanding returns. This quality emerges naturally when we truly understand our place in the larger web of existence. We are neither gods who can control everything, nor victims who can control nothing. We are participants in processes far greater than ourselves, and our role is to participate as consciously and skillfully as possible, while remaining open to outcomes we could never have imagined. I remember watching my grandfather work in his blacksmith shop when I was a boy. He would heat the iron until it glowed, then shape it with his hammer. But he never fought against the metal. He worked with its properties, understanding how heat changed its nature, sensing when it was ready to bend and when it would break if forced. His hammer blows were firm but never violent. He coaxed the iron into forms that seemed to emerge from its own essence, rather than being imposed from outside. Years later, when I began my work with the human psyche, I often thought of my grandfather's hands. The soul, I discovered, has its own properties, its own resistance points, its own readiness for transformation. Like heated iron, it becomes malleable under certain conditions, but will crack if pushed too hard or too quickly. The art lies not in forcing change, but in recognizing when change wants to happen and providing the right kind of support for that natural movement. This is why I have always been suspicious of therapeutic approaches that promise rapid transformation, that claim to fix people through the application of proper techniques. The psyche has its own timing, its own wisdom about what can be integrated when. Forced insights often create more problems than they solve, like a plant that has been given too much fertilizer too quickly and burns from the very nourishment it needs. True psychological healing follows the same principles as physical healing. It requires patience, attention, the creation of proper conditions, and above all, respect for the natural processes already at work within the person. The therapist's job is not to cure, but to midwife the client's own healing capacity into expression. But this understanding extends far beyond the consulting room. Every parent faces the same challenge with their children. How do you guide and protect while allowing natural development to unfold? How do you provide structure without stifling the unique essence trying to emerge through this particular young soul? I have watched parents destroy their children's natural vitality through excessive control, trying to shape them into predetermined molds without regard for who they actually are. And I have seen other parents fail their children through excessive permissiveness, providing no structure or guidance for natural development to follow. Neither extreme serves the child's deepest needs. The art of conscious parenting, like the art of conscious living, lies in finding the dynamic balance between form and freedom, between guidance and space, between protection and challenge. Children need both roots and wings, both security and adventure, both limits and possibilities for exploration beyond those limits. When my own children were young, I struggled with this balance constantly. My professional knowledge of human development was helpful to a point, but each child presented unique mysteries that no theory could fully illuminate. I had to learn to trust not only their natural unfolding, but my own intuitive responses to their particular needs. There were times when firmness was required, when clear boundaries served their development, and there were other times when stepping back, allowing them to make their own mistakes, trusting their inner guidance, even when it led them in directions I would not have chosen, this proved to be the greater gift. The same principle applies to our relationship with our own development, our own creative expression, our own deepest longings. We must learn to be both parent and child to ourselves. The parent in us provides structure, discipline, protection from truly destructive impulses. But the child in us knows what wants to be born, what wants to be explored, what brings genuine joy and vitality to our existence. Too often, we let the parent in us become a tyrant, suppressing every spontaneous impulse, demanding that everything fit into socially acceptable categories. Or we let the child run wild without any guidance, pursuing every whim without consideration for consequences or deeper purposes. Neither approach leads to the kind of integrated life that brings lasting fulfillment. I have found that the most creative periods of my life have come when these two aspects of my nature learned to collaborate rather than compete. The parent in me created the conditions for work, maintained the disciplines necessary for serious inquiry, protected the time and space needed for deep thinking. But the child in me provided the curiosity, the willingness to play with ideas, the openness to discoveries that challenged everything I thought I knew. When I was working on my most difficult theoretical problems, I often found that solutions came not through forced intellectual effort, but through allowing my mind to play freely with the material. I would gather all the relevant information, study it thoroughly, organize it as clearly as I could, but then I would release my grip on the problem and engage in activities that had nothing to do with psychology. I would work in my garden, carve stone, paint, take long walks by the lake, and invariably, while I was engaged in these apparently unrelated activities, connections would begin to form. Insights would arise that I could never have produced through direct mental effort. It was as if my unconscious mind continued working on the problem while my conscious mind was otherwise occupied and could only reveal its discoveries when I stopped trying to force them into existence. This taught me something essential about the nature of creativity itself. It cannot be commanded or scheduled or produced on demand, but it can be invited, welcomed, provided with the conditions it needs to flourish. Like a wild animal that will only approach when it senses safety, creativity requires a quality of inner spaciousness, of non-grasping, attention, of patient availability to whatever wants to emerge. I have noticed this same pattern in every creative person I have known. The musicians who create the most moving compositions are not those who sit down determined to write a masterpiece. They are the ones who remain open to the music that is trying to come through them, who can serve as clear channels for something larger than their personal will. The writers whose words carry real power are rarely those who set out to prove a particular point or achieve a specific effect. They are the ones who have learned to listen to the deeper currents of language, who can sense what wants to be said and find ways to let it speak itself through them. Even in the most practical professions, this principle holds true. The architects whose buildings feel most alive are those who can sense what wants to emerge from the particular combination of sight, purpose, and materials they are working with. They bring their technical knowledge and aesthetic training to bear, but they also remain open to possibilities they had not consciously planned. The successful farmers I have known work in partnership with natural cycles, weather patterns, soil conditions. They bring their accumulated knowledge to their work, but they also maintain a quality of attentive responsiveness to what the land itself is teaching them each season. This is what I mean when I speak of working with the grain of existence rather than against it. It requires us to develop capacities that our mechanistic age tends to dismiss or ignore. We must learn to sense subtle qualities, to feel the rightness or wrongness of situations, to recognize opportunities that cannot be detected through rational analysis alone. Such sensitivity develops only through practice, through countless small experiments in trusting our deeper perceptions rather than forcing our surface preferences. We must learn to distinguish between the voice of genuine intuition and the chatter of wishful thinking. We must develop the courage to act on insights that cannot be fully justified through logical argument. I remember a decision I made early in my career that seemed completely irrational at the time, but proved to be one of the most important choices of my life. I had been offered a prestigious position at a major hospital, exactly the kind of opportunity any ambitious young psychiatrist would seize without hesitation. But something in me felt deeply wrong about accepting it. I could not articulate what troubled me. The position offered everything I thought I wanted: security, status, the respect of my colleagues, a clear path toward professional success. But every time I imagined myself in that role, I felt a kind of interior recoiling, as if some essential part of myself was saying no with complete certainty. Against all rational advice, against the expectations of my family and mentors, I declined the offer. Instead, I chose a much more uncertain path, developing my own practice, pursuing research that interested me, even when it led away from accepted theories, following questions that seemed to lead nowhere. For years, this decision seemed like professional suicide. I struggled financially, faced criticism from colleagues, questioned my own judgment countless times, but gradually, this apparently foolish choice led me toward discoveries I could never have made within the constraints of conventional psychiatric practice. It allowed me to develop insights that became the foundation for everything meaningful I have contributed to human understanding. Had I forced myself to accept that sensible position, had I overridden my inexplicable inner resistance, I would have lived a perfectly respectable life that was completely wrong for who I actually was. I would have achieved success in terms that meant nothing to my deepest nature. This experience taught me to trust what I have come to call the wisdom of the body, the intelligence that operates through feeling and intuition rather than through logical analysis. This intelligence often knows things our conscious minds cannot yet grasp. It can sense the rightness or wrongness of situations before we understand why. It can detect opportunities and dangers that escape our rational faculties entirely. But learning to trust this deeper intelligence requires tremendous courage in a world that demands logical justification for every choice. We must be willing to act on perceptions we cannot fully explain, to follow paths that seem to lead away from our stated goals, to trust processes we do not consciously control. Such trust becomes possible only when we understand that we are not separate from life trying to manipulate it from the outside, but expressions of life attempting to know itself through the particular lens of our individual consciousness. When we truly grasp this, our entire relationship to uncertainty changes. Instead of seeing not knowing as a problem to be solved, we begin to recognize it as the very condition in which genuine discovery becomes possible. The most profound truths about existence cannot be grasped through intellectual effort alone. They must be lived into, felt into, discovered through the patient process of allowing life to teach us what we need to know. Such learning requires a quality of humility that our ego-driven age finds deeply threatening. It asks us to acknowledge that we are not the masters of existence, but students in a school whose curriculum we can glimpse only dimly. And so we come to the heart of it all, the great paradox that governs human existence. The more desperately we chase, the more certainly we lose what we seek. The harder we grasp, the more completely it slips away. But when we learn to open our hands, when we discover the courage to trust what we cannot control, life begins to offer us gifts we never knew existed. This is not surrender. This is awakening to who we really are.